My name is Haley Quinlan. I'm 23 years old. And 3 weeks ago, my father stood in front of 60 guests at what was supposed to be my graduation celebration, raised his glass, looked directly past me and said the words I will never forget. He said, "Haley's sister is the only one in this family truly worth celebrating tonight." He said it slowly, deliberately, like he had been rehearsing it. My mother smiled and nodded. Not a single person in that room said a word in my defense. Not one. I walked out of that banquet hall with my head held high and I didn't look back. But what happened in the days that followed? That's the part that changed everything. Before I get into all of it, if this kind of story connects with you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. I share stories like this every week and trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. Now let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand the full picture before any of this makes sense. Let me tell you about the Quinlan family. My father, Conrad Quinlan, is a cardiothoracic surgeon at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. He has been the kind of man who enters rooms and expects them to rearrange themselves around him for his entire adult life. My mother, Diane, spent 20 years as a hospital administrator before stepping back to manage what she calls the family brand, which is a real phrase she uses without a trace of irony. Then there's my younger sister, Brianna. She's 20, pre-med at the College of Charleston, and she has been the sun around which my entire family orbits for as long as I can remember. She's brilliant, genuinely. But brilliance and favoritism are two very different things, and in my house they were always treated as the same. And then there's me, the one who chose education. Specifically, I graduated with a degree in special education from Clemson University, with a focus on students with learning disabilities and developmental differences. I want to be the teacher that kids who fall through the cracks actually remember. The one who stays late, who notices the quiet ones, who figures out what finally makes a struggling child light up. I knew from the time I was 16 that this was what I was meant to do. I was certain of it the way you're only ever certain about a handful of things in your life. My father was not moved by my certainty. I still remember the night I told my parents about my acceptance into Clemson's College of Education. I was 18, sitting at the kitchen table with the acceptance letter in my hands, shaking slightly from excitement. My father read it in about 4 seconds, set it down and said, "You're going to spend your life managing other people's children for $40,000 a year." He didn't ask me why I wanted it. He didn't ask me anything. He summarized my entire future in one dismissive sentence and went back to his dinner. My mother patted my hand and said, "We just want more for you, sweetheart." As if wanting to pour yourself into children who need you most was somehow wanting less. From that night forward, the shift in our household was immediate and permanent. Every family dinner, every phone call, every holiday gathering became a platform for Brianna's future. Brianna's MCT prep scores. Brianna's research internship at MUSC. Brianna's medical school options. I graduated with a 3.9 GPA. I completed 2 years of student teaching in some of the most under-resourced schools in upstate South Carolina. I received letters of commendation from 3 separate principals. I won a departmental award for outstanding thesis research on literacy intervention for students with dyslexia. Not once in 4 years did either of my parents ask how my studies were going. Not once did they attend a single ceremony, a single event, a single milestone. I stopped expecting them to. But stopping the expectation doesn't stop the hurt. It just makes it quieter. There was, however, one person who never missed a single thing. One person who called every Thursday evening without fail, who remembered the name of every child I'd worked with during my student teaching placements, who kept every photo I sent her on her refrigerator like they were portraits in a gallery. My grandmother, Ruth Quinlan. My father's own mother, which is its own particular kind of irony. Ruth spent 35 years as an elementary school teacher in Charleston before retiring. My father has spent the better part of his adult life pretending that chapter of her history doesn't exist. She never pretends anything. She never has. 2 months before graduation, I received a text from my mother. Not a call. A text. It said, "Graduation dinner is booked at the Dewberry, Saturday the 14th, 7 p.m. dress formal. Your father has handled the arrangements." That was it. No question about whether the date worked for me. No mention of whether I wanted any input. No acknowledgement that this was, theoretically, a celebration of something I had accomplished. I texted back asking if I could invite a few people, specifically my supervising teacher from my final placement, Ms. Okafor, who had mentored me through the hardest and most rewarding year of my academic life, and two of my closest friends from Clemson who had been beside me through every late night and every difficult semester. My mother replied 40 minutes later. The guest list is already set. Your father invited the people who matter for the occasion. I read that message 4 times. The people who matter for the occasion. I set my phone face down on my desk and sat with that sentence for a long time. When I finally pulled up the guest list she forwarded the following day, I counted 58 names. I recognized maybe 15 of them. The rest were colleagues of my father's from MUC, hospital board members, prominent Charleston families my parents had spent years cultivating, and with a particular twist in my stomach, 3 of Brianna's friends from college. My friends were not on the list. My mentor was not on the list. The professors who had shaped my entire academic journey were not on the list. Brianna's sorority sisters made the cut. Mine did not. I called my grandmother that night. Ruth picked up on the second ring the way she always does, like she's been waiting. I told her about the guest list, the text, the phrase, the people who matter. There was a long pause, the kind that means she's choosing her words carefully. Then she said, "Did they invite me?" I hesitated and told her I wasn't sure. She made a quiet sound, something between a sigh and a decision. "I'll be there," she said simply. "Invited or not." I told her I didn't want her to cause trouble. She laughed, warm and short. "Haley, I spent 35 years fighting for children everyone else had already written off. Conrad's dinner party doesn't frighten me." The tears came before I could stop them. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. "There's something I need to tell you, but not yet. Call me after you hear from Dean Parrish." I stopped breathing for a second. "Dean Parrish? Grandma, what did you do?" She had already hung up. "Dean Parrish. Dr. Lorraine Parrish, the Dean of the College of Education at Clemson University." I had met her exactly once, briefly, at an end-of-year reception. She had shaken my hand and said my thesis supervisor spoke very highly of me. I had smiled and moved on, never thinking about it again. So why was my grandmother saying her name like it meant something? What had she done? I sat in my small Charleston apartment that night, staring at the ceiling, turning that question over and over in the dark. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, exhausted and restless, I made a quiet decision. Whatever was coming, I was done shrinking. I had spent 4 years becoming someone I was genuinely proud of, and I was done hiding her to make everyone else comfortable. I checked my email one last time before trying to sleep. There was a new message. The sender was the Office of the Dean, College of Education, Clemson University. The subject line read, "Important matter, request for in-person meeting." My heart hammered as I opened it. Dean Parrish's office was requesting to meet with me before the end of the week. The message said they had something to share formally, something that required a face-to-face conversation. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long time I smiled. I had no idea what was coming, but something told me it was going to arrive at exactly the right moment. The next morning I drove to my parents' house in Mount Pleasant, the quiet, manicured neighborhood just across the Ravenel Bridge where I grew up. I found my father in his home office, reviewing surgical case files. He didn't look up when I walked in. I told him I wanted to add a few names to the guest list. Ms. Okafor. 2 friends from Clemson. He turned a page without looking up. "The list is finalized." I told him this was my graduation, that these were people who had genuinely been part of my journey. He looked up then, and I wish he hadn't. Because what I saw in his face wasn't frustration or even dismissal. It was complete and total indifference, like I had walked in to ask about something that simply didn't register as important. "This dinner is an opportunity for this family," he said evenly. "Not a college reunion." He looked back down at his files. "Show up, be gracious, and let the evening be what it needs to be." I stood in the doorway for one long moment. Then I said, "I understand," and I left. I understood perfectly. I just wasn't planning on staying silent about it anymore. I drove to the Clemson University campus on a Tuesday morning, which meant fighting through the tail end of rush hour on I-26 before the highway finally opened up and the Blue Ridge foothills started rolling in on either side of the road. I made that drive dozens of times over 4 years, and it never got old. Something about leaving Charleston behind and watching the landscape change always felt like breathing out. That morning was different though. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was running hard. Dean Parrish had requested an in-person meeting. My grandmother had dropped her name like a quiet detonation and then hung up without explaining a single thing. I had spent the entire previous night cycling between excitement and dread, and by the time I parked and walked across campus toward Tillman Hall, I had convinced myself of about 6 different versions of what was waiting for me inside. The College of Education sat in one of the older buildings on campus, and Dean Parrish's office was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway lined with framed photographs of graduating classes going back decades. I stopped in front of one of them on my way past. Hundreds of faces, young and hopeful, holding diplomas. I thought about my own diploma, sitting in its mailing tube in my apartment because I hadn't bothered to frame it yet. My parents hadn't asked to see it. It hadn't seemed worth framing for an audience of one. The dean's assistant showed me in after about a 3-minute wait. Dr. Lorraine Parrish was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a desk covered in organized chaos, stacks of folders and printed reports with colored tabs sticking out at various angles. She stood when I walked in and shook my hand with the kind of firm, direct grip that tells you immediately what kind of person you're dealing with. "Miss Quinlan," she said. "Thank you for coming in. Please sit down." I sat. She settled back into her chair and folded her hands on the desk and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. "I'll get straight to it," she said. "I don't like wasting people's time, especially not people who've earned the right to have theirs respected." She opened a folder on her desk. "You graduated with a 3.9 cumulative GPA. Your thesis on phonological intervention strategies for students with dyslexia received the highest departmental score we have recorded in 11 years. Your clinical evaluations from every placement site were, without exception, exceptional. 3 principals submitted unsolicited letters of commendation on your behalf." She looked up. "We don't typically receive unsolicited letters from placement site administrators. We received 3 for you." I didn't know what to say. I managed something like, "I didn't know that." She nodded. "Most students don't. We keep departmental records internally. But I've been reviewing them because of what I'm about to tell you, and I want you to understand the full context." She reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk toward me. I picked it up. It was printed on official Clemson letterhead. As I read, my vision blurred slightly at the edges, not from tears, just from the sheer effort of processing what was in front of me. The South Carolina Department of Education, in partnership with the Clemson College of Education, had established a new initiative called the Carolina Classroom Fellows Program. It was a statewide program designed to place the most outstanding special education graduates in high-need school districts across South Carolina, with a full first-year salary supplement, a dedicated mentorship structure, and a pathway to a permanent district appointment. The program had 6 openings for its inaugural cohort. I was being offered one of them. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Dean Parrish. "How many people applied for this?" She smiled slightly. "We didn't open it to application. The 6 candidates were nominated directly by faculty and evaluated by a selection committee. You were nominated by 3 separate professors independently, none of whom knew the others had done so." I set the letter down on the edge of her desk because my hands weren't quite steady enough to keep holding it. "There's a starting salary figure on the 2nd page," she said. I turned it over. $54,000, plus the first-year supplement of $12,000. $66,000 to teach. In South Carolina. My father's voice surfaced in my memory instantly, unbidden. $40,000 a year. I almost said it out loud. I didn't. Dean Parrish was still talking. "The formal announcement of the inaugural cohort will be made at a small ceremony. We'd like to present each fellow publicly if possible, in a setting that honors the achievement appropriately. Is there an upcoming occasion in your life where that might be fitting?" I stared at her. I thought about the dewberry. About the guest list with 58 names I hadn't chosen. About the dinner that had been arranged without me, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. About my father's colleagues and Brianna's sorority friends and the event that was supposed to be mine but had been quietly, efficiently converted into something else entirely. I looked at Dean Parrish and I said, "Actually, yes. There is." She raised an eyebrow. "My graduation dinner is this Saturday," I said carefully. "It's at the Dewberry in Charleston. My family has arranged it." I paused. It's a formal event. 60 guests. A lot of prominent people in the medical and professional community. She studied me for a moment, reading something in the way I'd said it. Would it be appropriate for a representative from our office to attend and make the announcement there? I thought about my father standing at the head of that room with his champagne glass, already rehearsing whatever he was going to say about Brianna. I thought about my name not being on the banner. I thought about table placement and guest lists and the phrase, the people who matter for the occasion. And I said, I think it would be more than appropriate. Dean Parrish nodded once, slowly. Then we'll be there. I left her office 20 minutes later and stood on the steps outside Tillman Hall for a long moment, just breathing the early afternoon air. The campus stretched out in front of me, familiar and green and full of the 4 years I had poured myself into. I pulled out my phone and called my grandmother. Ruth picked up immediately. Before I could say a single word, she said, "How did it go?" I laughed, a short, slightly disbelieving sound. "Grandma, you called 3 different professors." There was a pause. "I called 2, she said. The third one apparently did it entirely on his own." I sat down on the steps. "Why didn't you tell me?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I knew she was choosing her answer the same way she chose everything, deliberately and without waste. "Because I didn't want you walking into that room hoping for something," she finally said. "I wanted you walking in as yourself and letting them see what I already knew. The hoping was mine to carry, not yours." I pressed my fingers against my eyes. "Grandma, don't cry on the steps of Tillman Hall," she said briskly. "Someone will think you failed an exam." I laughed again, longer this time. Then she said, "Has your father called you this week?" I told her he hadn't. She made a small sound. "He called me," she said. "Yesterday evening." I sat up straighter. What did he want? He wanted to know if I was planning to attend the dinner. She paused. I told him I was. He told me it wasn't appropriate for me to come uninvited. I told him it wasn't appropriate for a father to plan his daughter's graduation dinner without consulting his daughter, but that we all make choices. There was a beat. He hung up. I felt something shift in my chest, a tightening that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the particular feeling of watching someone confirm exactly who they are, and realizing that you had been right about it all along and had still, somewhere deep down, been hoping to be wrong. "He's going to try to control the room on Saturday," I said. "He always does." My grandmother's voice was calm. "He can try. But he doesn't know what's coming, and that's the difference." I asked her if she thought I was doing the right thing, letting Dean Parrish come, letting it play out in front of all those people. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Haley, your father has been performing for those people for 20 years. He's shown them a version of this family that centers him and erases you. I don't think it's wrong to let the truth show up to the same room he's been lying in." I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure I needed one. I drove back to Charleston that afternoon with the letter from Dean Parrish on the passenger seat. The sun was dropping toward the treeline by the time I crossed the Ravenel Bridge. The harbor spread out below in the kind of gold light that makes Charleston look like a painting. I had grown up in this city, spent my whole life trying to earn my place in it, in my family, in my father's version of what this family was supposed to be. I looked at that letter on the seat beside me. $66,000. 6 inaugural fellows. 3 independent nominations. And a dean who was willing to walk into a room full of surgeons and board members and say her name out loud. I thought about Saturday. About the gold script banner with the wrong words on it. About the back table where they'd planned to keep me quiet. They had no idea what was coming. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, neither did I, and that felt exactly right. The 2 days between my meeting with Dean Parrish and the Saturday dinner were the strangest kind of quiet. I went to work both mornings at the tutoring center where I'd been picking up shifts since graduating, helping elementary school kids with reading comprehension, and I moved through those sessions with a focus that surprised even me. There was a 7-year-old named Marcus who had been struggling with blending consonant sounds for 3 weeks, and on Thursday afternoon something clicked for him mid-session. He looked up at me with this expression of pure, unguarded shock, like he couldn't believe his own mouth, and then he broke into the widest grin I had ever seen on a child that age. I wrote it down in my notes afterward. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember it. That moment, that exact moment, was the reason I had chosen this path. Not for my father's approval. Not to compete with Brianna's medical school applications. For Marcus and every kid like him who just needed someone to stay in the room long enough to find the right key. I hadn't told anyone about Dean Parrish's visit on Saturday. Not my mother, not Brianna, and certainly not my father. I had replied to Dean Parrish's assistant confirming the venue address and the start time and left it at that. Part of me still wasn't entirely sure I was doing the right thing. I turned it over during the drive home Thursday evening, parked outside my apartment building and sat in the car for a few minutes just thinking. The honest version of what I was doing was this. I was allowing something true to walk into a room where something false had been carefully constructed. My father had built a very specific narrative over 2 decades, one where he was the architect of this family's success and prestige, where Brianna was the crown jewel of his investment, and where I was, at best, a footnote that politely didn't draw attention to itself. He had been telling that story to those colleagues, those board members, those carefully selected 60 guests for years. I wasn't crashing his dinner. I was just letting the truth buy itself a seat at the table he'd set without me. I called Ms. Okafor on Friday morning. She was my supervising teacher during my final placement at Pinewood Elementary in Columbia, and she was the person who had pushed me harder than anyone during that year while somehow also being the first person who made me feel like I genuinely belonged in a classroom. She picked up on the third ring, her voice warm and slightly out of breath the way it always was, like she'd just stepped away from something that needed her. I told her I had news. I told her about the Carolina Classroom Fellows program, about Dean Parrish, about the nomination. There was a long silence on her end and then she said, "Haley, 3 professors nominated you independently." It wasn't a question, it was the kind of statement someone makes when a thing they believed privately has just been confirmed publicly. Professor Denholm was one of them, wasn't he? Again, not a question. I laughed and said I wasn't sure. She made a sound that was half laugh, half something more emotional. "That man does not nominate people. I have known him for 12 years and I have never once heard of him nominating a student for anything." She paused. "He nominated you." I felt something settle in my chest when she said that. Professor Denholm was my thesis advisor, a quiet, exacting man who communicated primarily through margin notes and had said exactly 2 things to me that weren't about my research in 4 years. Once, near the end of my junior year, he had stopped me after class and said, "You see things in these children that most people spend an entire career learning to see. Don't let anyone talk you out of this field." The second time was at my thesis defense when the committee had finished their questions and stepped out to deliberate, and he had looked at me across the table and said simply, "You already know the answer to every question they just asked you." I had thought about both of those moments more times than I could count in the months since graduation. Knowing he had nominated me without saying a word about it to anyone, including me, felt like finding out that someone had been quietly keeping score on your behalf the entire time you were convinced no one was watching. Ms. Okafor asked if my family knew about the fellowship. I told her they didn't. There was a brief silence. "Your father," she said carefully. She had heard pieces of the story over the course of the year, not everything but enough. "He's going to be in that room on Saturday." I said yes. Another silence. Then she said, "Good." Just that. Good. I didn't ask her to explain it because I already understood exactly what she meant. Saturday arrived the way significant days always do, unremarkably at first, just light coming through the curtains and the distant sound of traffic on the street below my apartment. I gave myself exactly 1 hour to get ready and I used every minute of it deliberately. I had bought a dress 2 weeks earlier during a lunch break, a deep burgundy wrap dress that I had tried on once in the store, looked at myself in the mirror for about 4 seconds, and bought without deliberating. It fit well. It was the kind of dress that didn't ask for permission. I did my hair and my makeup without rushing, and when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror before leaving I didn't feel nervous the way I had expected to. I felt settled. There's a difference between those 2 things that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The Dewberry was exactly the kind of venue my father would choose. A historic hotel in the heart of downtown Charleston, all marble floors and brass fixtures and the kind of understated elegance that announces wealth without appearing to try. I arrived at 10 minutes to 7 and stood for a moment in the entrance, adjusting to the light and the hum of 60 people already moving through the room. The event space had been arranged with round tables dressed in white linen, low floral centerpieces, and the kind of ambient lighting that makes everyone look like they belong in a portrait. At the far end of the room, a banner stretched across the wall in gold script. It read, Celebrating the Quinlan family. Not celebrating Haley Quinlan. Not a graduation. The family. I was a category, not a name. I found my place card on a table toward the side of the room, not quite the back, but far enough from the center that the message was clear. My father was near the entrance, working the room the way he always did at these events, moving from cluster to cluster with his hand extended and his voice pitched at exactly the right volume, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to seem important. He saw me arrive. He gave me a single nod, the same nod he would give a colleague he recognized but didn't particularly need to speak to, and turned back to his conversation. My mother was near the head table, fussing over the placement of something, a centerpiece or a name card. She glanced up when I passed, gave me a brief tight smile and looked back down. Brianna was already seated at the head table in a pale gold dress, talking to one of her friends. She looked up when I walked by. Our eyes met for a moment. She looked away first. I found my seat and sat down and looked around the room from that vantage point. 58 people, most of whom had no idea who I was beyond being Conrad Quinlan's older daughter, the one who taught school. I had overheard that exact description at a family event 2 years earlier, spoken by one of my father's colleagues to another, not unkindly, just casually, the way you describe a piece of furniture that occupied a room without defining it. Conrad's older daughter, the one who teaches school. It was a quirk. A minor detour from the expected trajectory. My grandmother arrived at 7:15. I saw the shift in the room before I saw her. A slight reorientation of attention near the entrance. The way a room adjusts when someone walks in who carries themselves like they've never once doubted their right to be somewhere. Ruth Quinlan at 71 was not a woman who made herself small. She was dressed in a charcoal suit with a single strand of pearls, her silver hair swept back, her posture straight in the way that comes not from effort but from decades of standing in front of rooms full of children and refusing to be anything less than fully present. My father saw her from across the room. I watched his expression move through several things in the space of about 2 seconds, surprise, displeasure, and then the controlled reset of someone who has decided to manage a situation rather than react to it. He crossed the room toward her. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw her smile. That particular smile of hers that doesn't reach her eyes and doesn't try to. She stepped around him without breaking stride and came directly to my table. She sat down beside me, squeezed my hand once hard and said quietly, "She's here." I looked toward the entrance. Standing just inside the door, composed and unhurried, was Dr. Lorraine Parrish. Beside her was a woman I didn't recognize, carrying a slim leather portfolio. Dean Parrish caught my eye from across the room and gave me a single, small nod. My father hadn't noticed her yet. He was still watching my grandmother with that controlled expression, recalibrating, running through whatever version of this evening he had planned and trying to figure out what needed adjusting. He didn't know yet that adjusting wasn't going to be enough. Dinner was served at 7:30, and I will tell you honestly that I don't remember much of what I ate. The food was excellent, the kind of carefully composed plates that look more like architecture than a meal, but I was operating on a frequency that had nothing to do with appetite. I watched the room instead. I watched my father move through it with the ease of a man who had spent 30 years making sure every space he occupied reflected well on him. He laughed at the right moments. He touched arms and leaned in when someone was speaking, performing attentiveness with the precision of someone who had practiced it so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. My mother kept pace beside him when it suited the image and stayed with the table conversation when it didn't. They were good at this. I had grown up watching them be good at this and had spent years wondering why the same effort never extended to the hours when there was no audience. Dean Parrish and her colleague had been seated at a table near the side of the room. I had watched my father notice them during the appetizer course. He had leaned toward my mother briefly, said something low, and she had looked over with a small frown. I could see him processing it. 2 women he didn't recognize at a dinner he had personally curated. He would have assumed they were guests of one of the hospital board members, or perhaps a +1 situation someone had neglected to mention. He had no reason yet to connect them to me. As far as he knew, I was sitting quietly at my side table, doing exactly what he had instructed. Showing up. Being gracious. Not drawing attention. Brianna caught my eye during the main course from across the room. She held my gaze for a second longer than usual, which for Brianna was notable. She had always had the particular gift of looking at people without really seeing them, not out of cruelty, just out of the comfortable self-absorption that comes from growing up as the most important person in a room. But that second look was different. Something in it was uncertain. I didn't know if she could feel the tension in the room the way I could, the slight charge in the air that precedes something, or whether she was simply reacting to our grandmother's presence. Either way, I looked back at my plate and let it go. Whatever Brianna was feeling tonight was not my responsibility to manage. My father stood at 8:15 exactly when I expected him to. Conrad Quinlan ran to schedule the way other people ran to habit, and a dinner like this one had a script he had written long before anyone arrived. He tapped his water glass, the room settled, and he buttoned his jacket and looked out at 60 faces with the expression of a man who is entirely at home being watched. He thanked everyone for coming. He said something warm and polished about the meaning of family, about legacy, about what it meant to build something worth passing on. He was good at this part. I will not pretend otherwise. He had a surgeon's precision with language when he wanted to, the ability to make something practiced feel spontaneous, something calculated feel generous. Then he turned toward the head table and his voice shifted into something warmer and more personal, the voice he reserved for Brianna. He talked about her academic record, about her research internship at MUSC, where she had apparently impressed 2 attending physicians well enough that they had mentioned her by name to him at a department function. He talked about her medical school trajectory, about the Quinlan family tradition of medicine, about what it meant to him personally to watch that legacy continue. The room was attentive. Several of the physicians in the audience were nodding along with the particular approval of people hearing their own values reflected back at them. My mother was smiling at the head table. Brianna was looking at her hands. Then my father paused for effect, the way he always did before something he considered significant, and said the words I had been bracing for all evening. He said he wanted to raise a glass to the person in this family who had truly made him proud. He said he wanted to be honest tonight because honesty was something he valued above almost everything else. And then he said that Brianna was the only one of his children who had ever understood what this family stood for. That she was the one worth celebrating. That he hoped everyone in the room would join him in recognizing her extraordinary future. He raised his glass. Most of the room raised theirs. I sat with my hands in my lap and my glass on the table, and I looked at my father and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not rage. Not humiliation. Just a profound and clarifying sadness. The kind that comes when something you had been secretly hoping wasn't true is confirmed in front of an audience. I had known this was coming. I had prepared for it. And it still landed. My grandmother was the first person to move. She stood up from her chair with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to do and is not interested in being talked out of it. The room noticed. When Ruth Quinlan stood up in a room, the room adjusted. My father saw her. His glass was still raised. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the smile staying in place while everything behind it recalculated. "Ruth," he said with the particular tone of a man who is hoping that a single word will serve as a warning. It didn't. My grandmother looked at him across the room with the patience of someone who had spent 35 years in a classroom and had therefore encountered every possible variety of person who believes their authority is self-evident. "Conrad," she said, "you just gave a toast at your daughter's graduation dinner. Her name wasn't in it." The room went very still. A few people set down their glasses. My father laughed, a short controlled sound. "This is a family celebration, Ruth. I'd ask you to let the evening. You asked her to show up and not draw attention to herself," my grandmother said. "At her own graduation. I think the evening has already been what it was going to be. The question is whether anyone in this room is going to pretend otherwise." The silence was the particular quality of silence that happens when a social contract has been visibly broken and no one is quite sure who is responsible for repairing it. I saw 2 of my father's colleagues exchange a glance. I saw my mother's hand press flat against the tablecloth in front of her. And then I heard a chair push back near the side of the room and Dean Parrish stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was already quiet enough that when she spoke it carried easily to every table. "I apologize for the interruption," she said in the tone of someone who is not particularly sorry. "My name is Dr. Lorraine Parrish. I'm the Dean of the College of Education at Clemson University. I'm here this evening because I have an announcement that I believe belongs in this room." My father turned toward her. His expression had moved past recalibration into something closer to bewilderment. "I don't believe we've met," he said carefully. "No," Dean Parrish said pleasantly. "We haven't. She picked up the leather portfolio from the table and walked toward the center of the room with the same unhurried composure she had brought into my office 2 days earlier. Several guests shifted in their chairs to follow her movement. She stopped in the open space between the tables and looked out at the room and then looked directly at me. "Miss Quinlan," she said. "Would you come up here, please?" I stood. My legs were steadier than I expected. I walked from my side table to the center of the room and I was aware of 60 pairs of eyes tracking that movement, aware of my father watching from the head of the room with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between authority and the first edge of panic. I stopped beside Dean Parrish. She opened the portfolio. "Haley Quinlan," she said, addressing the room, "graduated from Clemson University's College of Education with a 3.9 GPA and a thesis score that was the highest recorded in her department in 11 years. She let that sit for a moment. She received unsolicited letters of commendation from 3 separate school principals during her student teaching placements. 3 professors nominated her independently for a highly selective fellowship program, none of whom were aware the others had done the same." She looked up from the page. "The South Carolina Department of Education has established the Carolina Classroom Fellows Program, a statewide initiative placing the top special education graduates in high-need districts across the state. There are 6 inaugural fellows." He turned to me. "Haley is one of them." She held out the formal letter. I took it. "The fellowship carries a compensation package of $66,000 in the first year." She looked back at the room. I watched the number register. I saw a physician near the front table recalibrate something in his expression. I heard someone near the back say very quietly, "$66,000 to teach?" Dean Parrish didn't smile exactly, but something in her face shifted with the precise satisfaction of someone who had anticipated that exact reaction. "For an exceptional educator," she said. "Yes." She looked directly at my father. "If anyone would like to discuss what that represents, I'm happy to." Conrad Quinlan said nothing. For the first time in my memory, my father had nothing to say. The room held its breath for what felt like a very long time. In reality, it was probably 6 or 7 seconds, but there is a particular quality to silence in a formal space when something irrevocable has just been said, and those seconds stretched in the way that only charged moments do. I was standing in the center of the room with Dean Parrish's letter in my hands and 60 people looking at me, and I became aware of something I hadn't expected. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't scanning the room for an exit or calculating how to make this easier for anyone. I was just standing there, present in a way I almost never felt in spaces my father controlled, like I had finally taken up exactly the amount of room I was entitled to. My father recovered first, the way he always did, because Conrad Quinlan had not built 30 years of professional authority by being slow to reassert himself. He smiled at the room, the practiced version, and said with careful lightness, "Well, it seems we have an uninvited guest with an announcement." He looked at Dean Parrish. "I'm not sure this was the appropriate venue for a university matter." Dean Parrish looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has dealt with far more formidable opposition than a surgeon at a dinner party. "Your daughter is an inaugural fellow in a statewide education initiative," she said evenly. "I would say her graduation dinner is exactly the appropriate venue." A man near the front table, one of my father's senior colleagues from MUC, a Dr. Aldridge who had known our family for years, cleared his throat quietly. "Conrad," he said, "let the woman finish." My father looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalibration, a weighing of options. He sat down. Dean Parrish turned back to the room. She wasn't finished. She reached into the portfolio and produced a second document, which she unfolded with the deliberateness of someone who had planned this sequence carefully. "I also want to share something that was submitted to our office independently," she said. "A letter from Professor Marcus Denholm, who served as Miss Quinlan's thesis advisor for 2 years." She looked up briefly. "Professor Denholm has been with the College of Education for 19 years. In that time he has submitted exactly 1 unsolicited commendation letter for a student. This one." She read from it without preamble. She said that Professor Denholm had written that in nearly 2 decades of teaching, he had encountered perhaps 3 students who possessed not only the academic rigor but the innate perceptual intelligence that the most exceptional educators carry, the ability to see a child not as a collection of deficits but as a person with a specific and discoverable way of understanding the world. He had written that I was one of those 3. He had written that whatever room I ended up in, the children in it would be fortunate. Dean Parrish folded the letter. The room was completely still. I looked at my father. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his expression had settled into something I didn't have a name for, not quite blankness and not quite shame, something in between that I had never seen on him before. My mother was beside him, very still, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Brianna was at the head table watching me with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time all evening, something open and young and slightly lost in it, like she was seeing a version of this family she hadn't known existed until 30 seconds ago. I looked at Dean Parrish and I said thank you quietly and directly, and she nodded once and stepped back, giving me the room. And I understood then that she was done. What happened next was mine to decide. I had not planned a speech. I had turned this moment over in pieces for 3 days, during the drive to Clemson, during sessions at the tutoring center, during Thursday night. But I had never assembled those pieces into anything formal because I knew that if I scripted it, it would sound like exactly what it was. And I had spent enough of my life watching performance mistaken for substance. So I spoke without notes and without a prepared structure, and I said what was true. I said that I had spent 4 years at Clemson working toward something that this family had never considered worth working toward. I said I had done it anyway, not to prove anything to anyone in this room, but because it was the right thing for me, and I had known that from the beginning even when no one around me agreed. I said that I understood my father's values and I was not interested in dismantling them, that he had built something real and I respected the effort it required. But I said that building something real does not give a person the right to decide that what someone else is building is worthless. I said I had accepted that for a long time. I was not accepting it anymore. I looked at my father when I said that last part, not with anger, just with the directness of someone who is finished looking away. He met my eyes. He didn't speak. I said one more thing. I said that the children I was going to teach, the ones in the high-need districts, the ones with learning differences and long histories of being told they weren't keeping up, those children were going to have someone in their corner who understood exactly what it felt like to be overlooked in a room that should have been paying attention. I said that was the career I had chosen and I was proud of it. Then I sat down. The applause started from Dr. Aldridge's table. A few beats later it had spread across most of the room. Not polite applause, the kind that fills the silence after a toast, but the kind that means something sustained and genuine. I heard someone near the back say, "That was something." I heard Dr. Aldridge say to the person beside him, "I had no idea. Conrad never said a word about any of this." My grandmother reached across the table and took my hand and didn't say anything at all, which from Ruth Quinlan meant more than a paragraph. My father did not applaud. He sat with his hands on the table and his expression still carrying that unfamiliar look, the one without a name, and I watched him from across the room and felt the strangest thing. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than triumph. Something closer to release, the particular lightness of finally setting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. The dinner ended quietly after that. Guests began making their way out in small clusters, stopping to congratulate me on their way through. Several of my father's colleagues shook my hand with a warmth that felt genuine and slightly embarrassed. The particular manner of people who are recalibrating something about a situation they had previously misread. Dr. Aldridge stopped beside me near the exit and said, "Your father is a brilliant surgeon, Haley. But tonight I learned something about his blind spots I should have seen sooner. Congratulations. What you're doing matters." I thanked him and watched him leave. Brianna found me near the coat check as the room was emptying. She stood in front of me for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "I didn't know about any of it. The fellowship, the commendations, the thesis score. I didn't know any of it." I looked at her. "You didn't ask," I said. Not harshly. Just as a fact. She absorbed that quietly. "No," she said. "I didn't. I want to though. Going forward." I thought about the years between us, what they had been built on, whether any of it was her fault, whether fault was even the right frame. "Then start," I said. "That's enough." She nodded and I believed her enough to leave the door open. I found my grandmother by the exit, already in her coat. She looked at me for a long moment with those steady eyes that had seen through every version of every difficult thing for as long as I could remember. "Well," she said. "That was a Thursday becoming a Saturday." I laughed, surprised by it. She straightened my collar with one quick precise movement the way she had done since I was small and said, You start with the fellowship in August? I told her September. She nodded. Then you have the summer. She squeezed my arm once. Use it well. She walked out into the Charleston night with her back straight and her chin level, and I watched her go and thought that 35 years in a classroom had produced something far more durable than my father's version of legacy. It had produced her. And somewhere in that, without ever intending to, it had also produced me. I drove home across the Ravenel Bridge with the harbor lights spreading out below in both directions and Dean Parrish's letter on the passenger seat and the city opening up ahead of me. My father had not spoken to me before I left. My mother had pressed my arm briefly near the door, something wordless that I decided to receive as the beginning of something rather than the continuation of nothing. I didn't know what came next with either of them. I had stopped pretending I could predict or control what they would choose. What I knew was this. In September I would walk into a classroom in a high-need district somewhere in South Carolina, and there would be children in it who needed someone to stay in the room and pay attention and refuse to give up on them. I was going to be that person. That had always been the plan. It was still the plan. Everything else, my father's silence, my mother's ambivalence, the 60 guests and the gold script banner and the side table they had put me at, all of it was just the noise that surrounded a decision I had made at 16 and never once genuinely doubted. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't need anyone else to confirm that. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet and something faintly citrus from the hand sanitizer dispenser bolted next to the door, and I had come to love that smell the way you come to love any smell that belongs to a place where something real happens every day. It was a Tuesday in late February, which in Charleston means the cold has mostly given up but hasn't entirely admitted it yet, and my third period group had just filed out in their usual chaos of backpacks and half-finished conversations and someone's water bottle rolling under a desk that I would find later and add to the growing collection on the windowsill. I stood at the whiteboard for a moment after they left, looking at the word web we had built together that morning. At the center of it in my handwriting was the word brave. Branching out from it in various colors were words the kids had contributed. Scared but doing it anyway. Trying when it's hard. Telling the truth even when nobody wants to hear it. That last one had come from a 9-year-old named Deja who had been in my class since September and who said things with the casual precision of someone who had been paying very close attention to the world for a very long time. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the dinner at the Dewberry. 6 months since I stood in the center of that room with Dean Parrish's letter and 60 pairs of eyes and my father's silence settling over everything like weather. It felt from here like something that had happened to a slightly different version of me, not a worse version, just an earlier one, the one who still hadn't fully believed that the life she was building was enough on its own terms without anyone else's endorsement attached to it. That version of me had known it intellectually. She just hadn't felt it all the way through yet. The Carolina Classroom Fellows Program had placed me at Archer Elementary in North Charleston, one of the highest need schools in the district, which was exactly what I had asked for when they gave us placement preferences in August. My cohort coordinator had looked at my form and said, "Most fellows rank this 1/3 or 4th. I told her I wanted it first. She had smiled in a way that suggested she had been hoping someone would say that. My classroom had 22 students, ages 8 and 9, 14 of whom had identified learning differences ranging from dyslexia to processing disorders to a handful of profiles that didn't fit neatly into any single category, which is true of most interesting people. I had spent the first 3 weeks of September simply watching them, learning who needed the room to be quieter and who needed more movement and who needed to be called on before they raised their hand because raising their hand felt like too large a declaration. By October I had stopped consulting my notes and started just knowing. That's when I understood that Professor Denholm had been right. Not about me being exceptional. Just about this being the right fit. Some things click into place and you feel it in a way that doesn't require outside confirmation. This was one of them. I had heard from my father twice in 6 months. The first time was a text 3 weeks after the dinner. "I have been thinking about what was said. I may have handled some things poorly. I want to talk when you're ready." I read it 4 times and then I set my phone down and went for a long walk along the waterfront and thought about what I actually wanted from a conversation with Conrad Quinlan at this particular point in my life. What I decided was that I wasn't ready yet, and that not being ready was a complete and sufficient answer that I didn't owe anyone an apology for. I replied, "I appreciate that. I'll reach out when I'm ready." He had not pushed. That was either growth or strategy, but either way the boundary had held. The second contact was a card that arrived in early December. A Christmas card with his handwriting inside that said simply, "I am proud of you, Haley." It was the first time he had written those words in my direction in 23 years. I put the card on my kitchen counter and looked at it for several days. Then I put it in a drawer. Not because it meant nothing. Because I was still deciding what it meant and I wasn't going to rush that to make anyone more comfortable. My mother had done something that surprised me. In October she had driven to North Charleston on a Thursday afternoon and waited in the school parking lot until my last class finished. And when I walked out to my car she was leaning against hers with 2 coffees from a place I recognized as my favorite in the city. I stopped when I saw her. She said, "I was in the area." Which we both knew wasn't true because no one is accidentally in the parking lot of Archer Elementary on a Thursday afternoon. I took the coffee. We walked to a bench near the edge of the lot and sat, and she told me that she had been thinking about the dinner and about a lot of other things going further back than the dinner. She didn't use the word sorry easily, my mother. It cost her something to say it, and when she said it that afternoon it had the weight of something that had been assembled slowly and with care. She said she was sorry for the guest list. For the text message. For the years of conversations that had revolved around one daughter at the expense of the other. For telling me I was being dramatic when I wasn't being dramatic at all. I sat with my coffee and I listened to all of it and I said, "Thank you for coming." And I meant it. It wasn't the resolution of everything. It was just a door opening and I decided to let it stay open. Brianna called every 2 weeks without fail, which was more consistency than I had seen from her in the entirety of our shared childhood. She had deferred her pre-med track for a semester to figure out whether medicine was genuinely what she wanted or simply the path of least resistance in a family that equated medicine with worth. I thought that was one of the bravest decisions she had ever made and I told her so. She had laughed and said it didn't feel brave from the inside, it felt terrifying. I told her that was the definition of the word as far as I was concerned. We were building something between us that neither of us had a name for yet, something more honest than what we'd had before, which had been proximity dressed up as closeness. I was patient with it. So was she. That was enough for now. Ruth came for dinner every other Sunday. She would arrive with something she had baked, always wrapped in a dish towel she'd had for 30 years. And we would sit at my kitchen table while she told me stories about the years of her career I hadn't heard yet. There were a lot of them. She had been in classrooms for longer than my father had been a surgeon, and she had stories that ranged from funny to heartbreaking to the particular category of story that is both at once. One evening in January she told me about a student she'd had in her second year of teaching, a boy named Terrence who had been written off by every teacher before her as unteachable, and how she had spent an entire semester figuring out that he didn't process written language the way the curriculum assumed, and how the day he read a full paragraph aloud to her without stopping was one of the best days of her professional life. She paused after she told me that and looked at me across the table and said, "I think about Terrence when I think about you." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I mean that the people who told me he couldn't were very confident. And they were completely wrong. Confidence and accuracy are not the same thing." I didn't say anything. He picked up her fork. "Your father is a very confident man," she said in the same even tone. "That's all I'm going to say about that." I laughed and she allowed herself a small smile, and that was the end of it. I thought about that conversation later, sitting on my apartment balcony with the city spread out below in the particular way Charleston looks at night when the harbor lights are on and the air carries that edge of salt it always has this close to the water. I thought about everything that had led to that room at the Dewberry and everything that had followed from it. The fellowship. The classroom. Marcus unlocking a consonant blend on a Thursday afternoon. Deja's word on the whiteboard telling the truth even when nobody wants to hear it. My mother in a parking lot with 2 coffees. A Christmas card in a drawer I kept meaning to take out and hadn't yet. A sister finding her way toward honesty one phone call at a time. A grandmother who had been keeping score quietly and correctly for 23 years. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 6 months ago. I knew the facts of my situation before the Dewberry. I had always known them, but knowing the facts of something and being finished carrying it are 2 different things. What changed that night was not that my father was exposed or that Dean Parrish said the right words or that the room applauded. What changed was something interior that I can only describe as a settling, like a foundation that had been slightly unlevel for years finally finding its true grade. I stopped waiting for the approval to arrive before I allowed myself to believe in what I had built. That is a small shift in words and an enormous shift in everything else. That turned out to be the only shift that mattered. My classroom is the most real place I have ever stood in. The children in it are the best evidence I have that the choice I made at 16 was the right one. And on the mornings when I unlock that door and turn on the lights and wait for 22 people to file in and take their seats, I feel something that I have decided to simply call enough. Not perfect. Not finished. Not without its hard days and its exhausting weeks and its moments of genuine doubt. But enough. More than enough. My father wanted me to understand what this family stood for. I think I finally do. I just came to a different conclusion than he intended. And I am at peace with that in a way that requires no one else's agreement to hold. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.